Yesterday, I was supposed to give you a short presentation outlining the why and the what of the Chancellor's Academy, but our morning ran long, and I thought it wise to figure out how to do it later in the Academy. Little did I know that we would not have a keynote speaker for today, and I apologize in advance for not being Charles Payne. I'm just as disappointed as you are. But between that and following Pedro Nogueira, needless to say, I'm feeling a little bit of pressure. So let me take a minute to make a few comments about what I would have said yesterday, and then I'm going to talk about assessment for learning. And you got from Bill's introduction of me that I'm a math education person, so there'll be some math examples in there, but I'm going to be talking about assessment for learning, which is very appropriate for the themes of this year's Chancellor's Academy. As you know, the theme is making teaching and learning visible, and Dean Colenses actually did a very nice job of pointing out how important that is. I would like to add a little bit more before focusing on assessment for learning. I don't need to tell you that teaching is very complex activity. So when we unpack teaching and we pull it apart, we know that certain teaching practices lend themselves better to high levels of learning than do others. So those practices that produce high levels of learning we call high leverage teaching practices. Some people call them micro practices. Different people organize and sort them in different ways. No matter what you call them and how you sort them, the bottom line is this: they are the instructional tasks that constitute teaching and can be applied across any subject matter domain for high student learning. So what are these practices? Let's name some of them. They include actions like eliciting and interpreting students' thinking, providing oral and written feedback, and there are quite a few of them. You're quite familiar with them. But with the center's focus on improving instruction through high-leverage teaching practices, we borrow from Teaching Works at the University of Michigan. What the Michigan education researchers have done is they've identified 19 practices that they consider to be high-leverage practices. And they take these from the research on teaching and learning. Now, these are not new to you, I am sure of that. They have been long advocated in documents like the Principles and Standards for School Mathematics, Next Generation Science Standards, and Standards for the English Language Arts. What is new is the Center's focused professional development approach on making explicit these practices in and through content so that teachers can be deliberate, they can be strategic in their instructional practices and equipped to improve the learning of any student in their classroom, much like what Nogueira was talking about yesterday. Many of you in this room participated in a survey with these 19 practices on there. And you were asked to rank the practices that you were interested in order of preference. And this is what you came up with, as you know: making content explicit through explanation, modeling, representations and examples, setting up and managing small group work, and collaborative conversations with students. So we built this year's Chancellor's Academy around these practices. And as you experienced yesterday, the elementary strands take up making content explicit through explanation, modeling, examples, and so on. The secondary strands took up and are taking up setting up and managing small group work, and they embed collaborative conversations with students within the small group practices. I hope you appreciate these are very rich sessions. You're addressing the Common Core State Standards, the Danielson Framework, and culturally sensitive practice. And I also hope that you notice that these things are being addressed in the teacher share-outs in the afternoon, where you get to see your colleagues and how they use these things in their own classrooms. So now let's talk about assessment. A few years ago, if I asked a general audience what they think of when they hear the word assessment, I was likely to get responses like tests, exams, scores, stomach ache, panic attack, anxiety. You know, those are the responses that I got. But these days, in the current climate, at least in the teaching profession, there is a growing appreciation for the role of assessment in teaching and learning. And that is good news. Now, you all know about formative assessment or assessment for learning. I like to actually use the term assessment for learning, but formative assessment rolls out of my mouth a little bit more easily. So I use those terms interchangeably. But formative assessment is a high-level set of practices. Very high leverage, eliciting student thinking, interpreting student thinking, being able to provide productive oral and written feedback, etc. You've seen these micro practices that constitute formative assessment. Now, for the purpose of this talk, I like to think about assessment as belonging to each of two categories, summative and formative. The intent is not to put these in opposition to each other, but to use the categories as a heuristic to help us think about how assessment plays out in schooling practices. Now, as I've already said, you're familiar with assessment, but assessment will bring up summative examples like the ISAT, the MCAT, the ACT, the GREs, etc., or for making judgments about the quality of students' learning. We teachers do that well, like in midterm exams, final examinations, and the like. And there are a variety of purposes for summative assessments. Admissions to programs, for example, assignment of course grades, and summative assessments, as we all know and understand very well, are used for accountability purposes like the NCLB. On the other hand, formative assessment is the elicitation and the collection of evidence of student learning. Teachers elicit and they collect this evidence in a variety of ways, questioning, observing students in small groups, diagnostic testing, and so on. And they use this to inform their instruction. Now, there are a lot of highfalutin definitions about formative assessment, and here's one. This is Gary Cizik's definition, and it's emphasizing the non-evaluative context in which assessments happens. I'll let you read that. I'm not going to read that to you. Here's another highfalutin definition. And this is Fred Erickson's definition. And he uses the word proximal for the kinds of formative assessment that we're trying to hang out in this morning. And he emphasizes the temporal with proximal, by saying proximal, those are temporal aspects. That is, during the course of instruction is when assessment ought to be taking place. Instruction is the mastery of these skills take place in real time. And that, if you're familiar with Erickson, that is what he is talking about and emphasizes. But here's a less highfalutin definition. And I like this one because it captures the nitty-gritty of what classrooms teachers have to do. Formative assessment is the process of eliciting and collecting, interpreting and using evidence of student learning, such that it informs productive instructional practices. And that's drawn from Black and William, if you're familiar with them, and Torrance and Pryor. Formative assessment is the core aspect of teaching. It is the core aspect of teaching. And there are languages that don't distinguish, that have words that don't distinguish teaching and learning. For example, in, I believe it's Mandarin. Someone knows that, knows exactly what that is. Please stand up and tell us how to say it. But one of my graduate students said that there's a word in Mandarin, and it means teaching and learning, and that's the word you use when you're talking about teaching and learning. And I find that fascinating because we have two words for it, and it causes us some problems, which I want to share with you in a minute. So what I'm trying to show here in this wonky graphic of mine is that formative assessment mediates teaching and learning. Teaching and learning should not be separate and disparate acts. They should be integrated activities. This is a point that doesn't get enough emphasis in the highfalutin definitions, in the scholarly definitions, and the conceptual literature about formative assessment. You are familiar with the wide variety of assessment tools and practices. They include quick writes, exit slips, whiteboards, thumbs up and down, those things, but they also are things that require you to pay attention to students as they are working in groups, as they are working individually, being able to provide feedback, both oral and written, using peer assessment and having rubrics that students are using to assess themselves and to assess others, and using rubrics as the way of clarifying and defining what counts as success on the task. I don't think this can be overemphasized. Formative assessment practices allow students to practice new knowledge and skills without fear of being graded. Now imagine the child who's already in a stressful environment. You know, Pedro made some reference to the stress that some children live in. The child who's already performing low, and if he's in a classroom where there's group work being done, being supported by both his friends, his peers, and the teacher, and knowing that he's not going to be evaluated until he has learned the material, I think takes care of many, many problems. Problems like behavior, low self-esteem, lack of motivation. I think it's very, very important that we make sure we're giving students time to learn without fear of being graded. I'd like to make a distinction between what we do as we teach and what we do after we teach. As we teach, I like to call that discourse-based assessment practice. After we teach, we're in the business of analyzing student work so we can figure out what to do the next day. Now, here's one concrete example. Now, this is just a sliver of an excerpt from a classroom. Not necessarily intended to characterize the whole thing, but you'll get my point here. So the teacher says, what is 23 plus 8? And the student answers 30. And then the teacher says, that's incorrect, who knows the correct answer? And then students in unison say, 31. And the teacher says, great, let's move on. Now the teacher is assessing. The teacher is assessing student understanding in this particular example. Let's take a look at a teacher in a slightly different world who's also assessing as she teaches. What is 23 plus 8? The student says 30. The teacher says, why do you think it's 30? Because, you know how students do that? Because, and they're not going to answer, but she doesn't let him get away with it. Because what? She's prompting him to answer, oh, I messed up. Where did you mess up? 3 plus 8 is 11. That's where I messed up. 20 plus 10 plus one more is 31. Is there any disagreement about Sean's answer? And she waits very deliberately. Great, let's move on. Okay. So, turn and talk to your neighbor about this exchange and about this exchange. I'll give you a few moments to do that. Then I'd like to just share. Thank you for your participation. I'd like a couple of you to share your thoughts about your takes on these two different examples. Someone volunteer somebody at your table. Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
In the first script, it was kind of like the teacher corrected, of course, that the answer was wrong and addressed that, but the rest of the students were able to give the correct answer as opposed to making sure that student knew what they did wrong and made the correction. And I think on the second one, it was more of helping that student build confidence because they worked it out and was able to come up with the right answer. And so that, of course, teaches them how to correct their own mistakes and problem solve, and at the same time giving them confidence to do it.
Thank you. Anyone else, please? Yes, sir.
I think in the first script, just the teacher response was probably, could be a little bit damaging for that student emotionally.
Talk about that some more.
Well, it's just like, right away, that's incorrect. And the student, had that confidence to even raise their hand and answer that question. And then they get shut down like that, and then the teacher just moves on, and everybody else says, all right, the answer is 31, and great, let's move on to the next problem. So that kid feels like everybody else is great, but what about me? If you look at the second example, this is a little bit more all-encompassing where you're taking that student's error and turning it into a teachable moment for everybody, because I think it's safe to assume that that student probably wasn't the only student that was going to get the answer wrong, but they were the ones who took that chance. So now we're taking that mistake and we're turning that into a teachable moment for everybody. And, I think it also helps build the confidence of that student, because it's not just saying you're wrong, let's move on. It's we're going to help you, we're going to get you through this, together, and now it's a lesson for everybody, just not that student.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I was just going to feedback off that without saying that that's wrong and allowing for the teachable moment, you're also increasing the safety of the classroom, right? It's okay to make mistakes. There's no judgment here. It's just we're all here to learn, growth mindset.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
The second script allows the student to do a self-assessment.
Talk some more about that, please.
The teacher didn't just say it's right or wrong. Why do you think it? So he thought himself all and he worked through his thinking and realized, oh, this is a place where I made a mistake. So he was allowed to do some self-assessment. Oh, I got it incorrect. This is how I got it incorrect. This is my process, and I corrected it.
Thank you. Any other comments about that? Yes, ma'am.
On the other hand, students well, because in that second example, a student may have a hard time thinking when being on the spot in front of a class of other children, might not be so comfortable with the languages exchange, why, because what, and they've got to think and say, I messed up. They might have a hard time doing that, depending on their personality.
Yes, and I think you brought up a very good point. It is important to know who your students are. Another thing that Nogetta said yesterday, we must know who our students are. And, this is taken out of context. It could be a situation where the teacher knows it's okay to press the child in this way. But yes, there are situations where perhaps this interchange you might want to do differently given who the child is. Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
I think that it's also the part where when the teacher throws, if the teacher's throwing on a regular basis, even when the answer's right, then the whole class can see I didn't hear the right way to do it, and maybe some mistakes that might happen. Because in this case, if the student's making a mistake and the teacher can figure out why, then that's a way to bring something into the teaching repertoire to fix that before you even get to the problem. If it's a regular basis, that conversation can get a lot of reinforcement of the right ideas and fixing of some of the misconceptions.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. Now, you're going to be getting a handout shortly while I set you up. It is? Oh, thank you, thank you. You're right on top of it. I really appreciate that. Okay. Now, the exchange in the second grade classroom is an example of interactions that occur. You can see how, depending on how you approach it, in the first exchange, all you pretty much know is the child's got the answer wrong. In the second exchange, the teacher is able to get at some understanding, the child's understanding. And as many of you have already said, the other students get to listen and watch, and that, of course, benefits their own thinking about that kind of problem. So it's a place value problem. Now, speaking of place value, here is a situation where we have to assess after we teach. So I want you to pretend like you are in grade level teams. You're all sixth grade teachers, And you've agreed to administer the problem 123 times 645 to see if your sixth graders can do this multiplication problem. And you administer it, not one, not two, but 35% of the sixth graders did the problem in the way that's shown on the slide. What do you do? What do you do? My hope is that you don't let it go because you figure, well, more than half got it right, right? What do you do? So what I would like you to do is take a look at the handout that you have. You're going to be using the handout merely as a guide. You can write on this. You weren't meant to have your own because I'm trying to force you to share like we like to do with our students in the classroom. And so with your neighbor, use this handout as a guide to help you make sense of the students' misconceptions. And I'll give you a few minutes to do that. Okay. If I can have your attention, thank you very much. So you are engaged in a very active process of trying to figure out, okay, we've got sixth grade students who are making these errors when they do multi-digit multiplication. What do we do about them? So you've collected the evidence of student learning, you've just finished examining the work, and now you need to interpret what these misconceptions are, and then use that evidence to inform your instruction. So, and before I go on, number 2 I have, what is the correct answer? And you might think that that's a trivial thing. I spent a lot of time at 4th grade, which was one of my favorite grades, and it was also very humbling. I think teaching, by the way, not only do you have to have ego, the guts to think you can teach, but you have to be willing to be humbled, much like Pedro said, you know, and I find I'm in a lot of agreement with him. Teaching is humbling. I remember in thinking that when I was trying to be reform-minded, trying to be a very powerful math teacher, one of the things I had my 4th grade students do is to create their own problems based upon their own experiences. I did that without thinking through some things. So when they came back, it was a homework homework they had to do. When they came back the next day and began to share their problems, I was horrified. And I bet you can imagine some of the things. Any ideas of what happened? Anyone hazard a guess? 4th graders? Yes, ma'am. Okay, too simple, all right. What else?
It might have been questions that they didn't themselves know the answer to.
Exactly. Questions they didn't know the answers to. So you got these very seemingly rich problems, but they couldn't solve them. And then I would say, well, what's the answer? You know, their peers couldn't solve them. And I would say, well, what's the answer? Well, they hadn't solved the problem either. So that taught me a lot. So now I say, okay, solve the problem first, guys, as you go through this, and then we'll talk about it. All right. Well, someone tell me, what was the correct answer? What was the correct answer to this problem? Say that louder.
I don't know if I did right, I was rushing. I was showing all of the courses.
It's okay, Jackie. 79,335, are we in agreement with that? Thumbs up? Great, all right, okay. So, I want you to, so what does these students who made this error, what do they know, and what do they not know, and what is the evidence of that? So anyone start talking?
They know multiplication.
Okay, they know multiplication, keep going.
They don't understand the idea of placeholders, so that when they're multiplying by that second number before, they're not multiplying by 4, they're multiplying by 40.
Okay,
They need to understand how to move those numbers over and understand what's actually happening in that problem.
okay,
So when you go to 6, it's 600, so you need to move things over twice and compensate for that and do your addition.
okay, thank you. Anything, what else do they know?
They understand how to do multi-digit, by single-digit multiplication with regrouping, but I wonder if they're understanding what's going on with face value in the actual problem. Do they understand that the 2 actually represents 20, or are they just remember the process? Do they have that face value conceptual learning?
So this is what I think, I guess I should talk here. They understand how to multiply. How do you know?
They get the times table stuff right.
Okay, what do you mean they get the times table stuff right? That's what happened when we the director and throw out answers.
It's a sociologist's explanation for knowing what 3 times 3 means, right?
Okay, so 3 times 3, they know their excellent, okay? Everybody in agreement with that? It seems that in this example, they know their multiplication facts. Okay? What else?
They can add,
And how do you know that? Yes, they can add. How do you know that?
because when they were adding up the 3 columns of 3-digit numbers, they added that correctly, no 5 plus 2 plus 8, they carried the 1.
And the carry.
Yes.
It also appears that when they're doing the multiplication of low-digit numbers, they know the process. They know to go with the ones area, and then go over to the tens, and then over to the hundreds. They do know that process of taking each number and multiplying by that.
Okay, so they got the procedure down. Okay, all right. Yes, ma'am.
Like, just to add to that, I think they memorize the way of doing it, but I don't think they really know why they're doing it. And I don't think they understand if it makes sense or not. Like, they can't look at their answer and say, that answer can't make sense. You know what I mean? So I don't think they get the bigger concept of multiplication. They memorize those facts,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe they know why those facts are so, maybe not, I'm not sure, but we don't know that. You know what I mean? It seems like the bigger concept of them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Jackie?
I can't, well, if I see that they've gone through it correctly, it doesn't necessarily mean they know their facts, because, I mean, they have the charts that they can use in the classroom. There's some kids, I get the name tags with multiplication charts on them. So they will reference the charts, you know, to put the answer down. So it doesn't necessarily mean they know their facts, it just might mean they know the steps. You know, they know how to access something that will give them, you know, the answer to that specific problem. So I wouldn't just conclude, oh, they know their facts.
And it, you know, and that the context matters. That's what you're pointing out, Jackie. And it's very important. You're in this 6th grade team, and are you allowing students to use their multiplication chart or not? So that certainly factors into the discussion that you have when you are examining the student's work. So let's say, just for the sake of this example, they don't use multiplication charts. But you're right, there are a lot of teachers allow students to do that. So let's assume then they can add, we figure they can know how to add, they know their multiplication facts, right? They're getting the answer wrong. There's a larger concept being missing. Several people have named that concept, and it was what? You heard your colleagues, place value. That is the concept that's being missed here. That is the misconception. And it's not uncommon, people, and those of you in junior high and high school will see examples of this lack of understanding, because it's pretty hard to understand the distributive property if your students don't understand place value understanding, okay? Have place value understanding. Okay, so now you know what they know and you know what they don't know. What are you going to do about it? How do you go about instruction? And we understand, for example, that it might not take one short lesson to remedy this problem. So now I'd like you to share how you might go about addressing this issue tomorrow, and then maybe the next day and the next day. How would you build a series of lessons that start to get at this misconception? Yes, sir.
I like to start with logic and estimation. I would round these down. I said, let's round them down. What's 100 times 600? And when they come up with the answer of 60,000, I said, is 1845 a reasonable answer? And they realized that's absolutely incorrect. So then they had that tool in their toolbox of estimation. They just didn't know how to use it or when to use it. And now they can go back and say, ooh, estimating, I'm way off. I need to figure out what I've done wrong.
Boy, estimation skills do come in handy here, right? Thank you. What else might you do? How else would you approach addressing this problem? Yes, sir.
I think about breaking the case into 3 separate multiplication problems. They take 123 times 5, 123 times 40, 123 times 600, and have each of the students work through those and see if they can get them right individually. Because especially if they have problems with the 40 times 1 to 3, I know they just have a strict problem of understanding what the placeholder was again. And I might give them a calculator and say, try it the method you did before, and test the calculator. And hopefully they present with ideas like, whoa, I multiplied a place of 10. And they need to realize that they're not just multiplying by 4, they're multiplying by 40. And they get more, and if you give them the same problem with 600, and they hopefully can realize the mistake, and that those places matter when they're doing multiplication, and bring it back together, maybe it's a separate lesson, to show them how when you do the addition, you need to also incorporate those placeholders.
Thank you. So partial products is what you're dealing with, and decomposing number. What else? Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, we thought about a couple different things. First, we thought, well, if half of the class is getting in, we might do some partner activities. But then also, in special ed perspective, in my class, we have like a graphic organizer that sort of blanks out the spaces where they're not allowed to put a number and just visually shows them where it's supposed to go. So we might have to use that so that some of the kids get a visual on exactly the way the problem is supposed to be lined up.
Okay, thank you. Any other ideas? Yes, Jackie.
I wouldn't start with this problem. I would probably start with some basic ones and then work, explain it through those simpler problems and then work back up to that.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I've had success with place value and number talks and using very precise language. So as the kids are in group talking it out, making sure that they are saying the word 40 instead of 4, so that we make sure that that concept is very strong.
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir.
I was just thinking, sorry, just kids on different elements, so they're not focusing on the multiplication chart as much as they're focusing on that 0 being significant. Start there and then work with multiples. Okay.
Great. Yes, ma'am.
I remember when I learned to do this, my teacher always told us to put, so like if I'm starting with 5, then my first answer is going to go underneath the 5. But if I'm using the 4, then I need to put a 0 underneath my 5 and start my first answer where the 4 is, and then start my next answer where the 6 is, so that way I knew to put zeros behind it, so that the first, like if I'm doing 4 times 3, then my first answer goes underneath the 4. So maybe just give them a visual of that too.
Thank you. Stephanie, way in the back.
I'm a visual learner. I would have everybody involved. We want to get through this. I have kids come up, all right, you are 5, you go eat. And so they can visually see it. I know that sounds crazy. Because if we're all going to be in this together, then we're all going to be in this together. I don't care, yeah, you got to say 50% got it right, but everybody needs to work on it, because I want everybody to get it together. And if you really say, okay, Dave, you're going to be 500 somebody. Lisa, that's her. You're going to be you're quiet. You're going to be a silent number. Maybe that's not easy, but maybe that's the third and second grade. But then you get her up, and then everybody's like, oh man, if she's that, then we can move over. Then you have everybody go, but this number is this, you see that? Then everybody can visually see it, and they're participating, and then you'll have to work with everybody else.
Thank you. Thank you. And if this were a smaller, intimate setting, we could compare strategies and then come up with a sequence of activities as an approach to remedying this problem. That's what I would encourage, in working with teacher study teams, to do precisely that, because you have excellent ideas. How are they integrated? How do they work together? And how can we come up with a sequence of 3 or 4 or 5 lessons so that when we're done and we give a problem similar to this again, they will get it correct. That's your goal. Okay. Thank you. Okay. It's important for me to point out that the kinds of things you just completed doing does occur within a larger scheme of assessment. Dylan Williams says that it's very, very important to share your criteria for success with students. He says that teachers must orchestrate classroom discussions in ways that allow for productive questions and tasks so that you can elicit the information in the first place. The feedback that you give has to be productive feedback. It has to be feedback that says something about the quality of students' thinking. Yes, you're going in the right direction, Brian, as opposed to good, because students don't necessarily know what good means, what's good about what I'm doing. So being very task-specific or specific about their thinking and the feedback is what the literature is saying is the most helpful type of feedback. Moreover, students need to become responsible for their own thinking. And as teachers, we structure that. We structure and we help to promote their sense of responsibility by providing them with feedback so they can be self-regulating and metacognitive. But also, everybody in the room has to be responsible for each other's learning. It's part of building a safe environment that a couple of you have already alluded to, an environment where it's okay to make mistakes, and an environment where you can correct each other's mistakes and misconceptions. So imagine a classroom culture like that, especially when you think about students who are historically underperforming. What might be the negative consequences of poor assessment practices? Well, when it's not done well, we all suffer. Poor learning, poor student motivation, behavior problems, post-secondary opportunities go down the drain, because a career of this, an academic career of this, is cumulative. And I was a school teacher, and the 6th grade teacher complains about the 5th grade teacher, and the 9th grade teacher complains about the 8th grade teacher, and so on. The effects are indeed cumulative, and we all feel them. So we need students to learn well for a variety of reasons. And yes, I agree with Pedro, so they can pay the taxes, so that we can have healthy retirements in in our old age, and that's not a trivial issue, people. This is very serious stuff. We need to get these kids educated, reading, writing, thinking mathematically. It's for their own good, but it's also good for the nation. Now, this is just good teaching, right? I hear this all the time, and I agree, but as it turns out, the centrality of formative assessment in teaching is difficult to convey, very difficult. It's a hard nut to crack, as I like to say. And if you don't believe me, let's take a little walk down the lane here. I don't have time to assess my students. I am just too busy teaching. I don't see how formative assessment works since I have to assign grades. Formative assessment contributes to grade inflation. These are authentic, actual statements that teachers make. Now, turn and talk to your neighbor and talk about what's hanging up the teachers in each of these statements. What's the hang-up? Life in schools is hard, right? We have tremendous amounts of responsibilities, and now they're coming around telling us we got to do formative assessment. You know, just one more thing. But I know that you have had a lot of exposure to formative assessment tools and practices, and so these things are not unfamiliar to you. But you still get, but formative assessment is not yet a mature practice in the nation's classrooms. And I want to explore why that's the case. So I've given you examples of the kinds of statements that one may hear as you walk around talking to teachers. The first one, I don't have time to assess my students. I am too busy teaching. Amen. Okay. I don't see how formative assessment works since I have to assign grades. Formative assessment contributes to grade inflation. Okay? What are your thoughts about these statements? What are your thoughts about these statements? Anyone? Thank you. Really appreciate your participation this morning. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
I think when we were talking, and I kind of feel like if you're teaching, then how on earth aren't you doing formative assessment? And so maybe there's just a slight ignorance of what formative assessment really is based on these people. I mean, I don't know necessarily the context and what the questions were asked, but I'm assuming that if you're teaching, you are doing some type of formative assessment. Otherwise, what on earth are you doing?
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I was just gonna say, I think the hang-up is a lot of times people associate formative assessment with a pen and paper assessment that then has to be graded, and I have to stop teaching, okay, everyone get out a pencil, let me pass them out. And so that takes away, people might be worried about getting through the book, right? And so that's kind of what we talked about. But then we also talked about too, how, like especially, at least from the elementary school perspective, there's been a big push to like workshop models where that frees up the teachers so that students are working collaboratively so that you can do formative assessments just by observing, or, so the class time doesn't have to stop necessarily for a pen and paper test.
Okay. Thank you. Yes.
And I'm definitely not elementary, I teach high school. And I would say that, and I don't teach math, I would say that when I do formative assessment, it is constant. I agree totally. I mean, you're constantly listening to your students' input. That's assessment. But formative assessment is part of the classroom. And I pretty much learned over the years before it became the thing to
don't have any clue that what I'm writing is off limits to myself. But they are all convinced that I'm constantly assessing them. And periodically, I will say, you've had your opportunity to work with this and study this and go home and look at it again, which might be idealistic, but I say it anyway. And then I'm going to be listening today to what you do and actually figuring out where I would put you on a 6 to 10 scale. And so I periodically do put in some grades, but I don't think they are inflated. I think they're an accurate assessment of where they've gotten, and by then I feel like they should have gotten somewhere. So it's a little bit of a, like a mid-placement.
So you're resonating with the high school teacher's statement here.
I am. I think that, and I think that's, I don't know why they would think formative assessment would contribute to grade inflation. That makes no sense to me. Because I would never, a summative assessment, I would give it after I thought all my formative assessment information was at the point where at least the large majority of my students had enough understanding that they should be able to do a summative assessment. Maybe that's what they mean, that the summative grade goes up, but why is that inflation? If you're just saying these students gotten to the point where they are all getting B's and A's, that's not inflation, it's a reward for their hard work.
Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else? Where are the teachers' hang-ups here? Jackie, go ahead.
I can see where the first statement would come from. It's difficult to get those unit tests in for math, but it's kind of how do you use it. I was talking with some members at my table about how having the curriculum, the timeline, and how quickly everyday math kind of moves. It's one house and the next one, the next one, and then looking at the report card, because those are specific areas that address different kind of math concepts that they need to have, and you don't always have the time to use the assessment to see, okay, these kids didn't do this. I would love to have the time to use the assessments for seeing what needs to be retaught, spending more time on that, but it's very difficult to do when the timeline is saying, okay, we move on to this now, we gotta go on to this and that. And it's, if I had the time to do it, I would, but then you look at the report card and see that maybe I didn't get to some concepts that quarter, and then that's a problem because there's, some little areas of blank. And so it's just like domino effect of problems that happen. That's where I kind of saw that.
Right. Pressures and demands contribute to how you think about these things. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I was just going to suggest maybe that's something that needs to be talked about with the administrators, right? Because I know in our building, we got permission to, if you need to go back and reteach, don't worry about that curriculum calendar, right? And so I think that we need to, are we really worried about trying to get through this whole map before May? Or are we really concerned with actual student growth here? Are we, like Pedro said yesterday, are we really worried about that assessment and that score at the end of the year, or what's really our priority?
Okay.
But I think it has to come from top down, the freedom and that, give your teachers permission to do what is best for their students and not worry about that timeline.
Okay, thank you. I saw 2 more hands. Yes, ma'am.
Even at the intermediate level of elementary school, you can still have stations and centers, and it's not just a standard delivery anymore. It's not just talking all the time. It's paperwork. You will, students, like you said, students being responsible for
Absolutely, absolutely. I see some more hands. Yes, ma'am.
I mean, I think that this can also go across curriculum. I'm not a math teacher, but I use exit slips as part of an assessment, and it doesn't take away from my instruction time. If you have certain skills that you need the students or you need to assess the students on, even just having a simple exit slip that you can plan for your next class, that can help you with your grouping. I mean, where's my reteach group? Where's my enrichment group? Where is this group that just needs more practice? And it doesn't take away from your instruction time at all. I think that can be helpful. I found it to be helpful.
And I see two more. Yes, ma'am.
When I listen to these, it seems like, when we have a task and I have to check this off my list of things to do, instead of looking at formative assessment as part of the teaching framework. Am I wanting to hear myself talk all day and lecture you, or am I having an interactive conversation where we're collaborating together and I can just use that time to see what it is as opposed to just telling you? And like, for instance, I like to use attendance as a time to see what kids know. When I call your name and say good morning, tell me, what the Nile River was for, or whatever like that, So giving kids a chance to speak too, and that's an easy formal assessment. I heard someone else say that sometimes we don't really understand maybe what that looks like. It's not something that I have to add to the grade book. It doesn't need to take a lot of time, but if we're collaborating and working with our kids, then we're already assessing.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Stephanie.
The two others say I. And I'm teaching because now you get to collaborate with, if you feel like this, when you talk with some other young people and seasoned people, and get to talk about, okay, this is what I'm feeling, or your instructional goals. And you say, okay, I don't have access, so how can we do this? How can we make this happen? Or I don't say how formative assessment works. Well, okay, since I feel, how can we do this to maybe have it work? Because this is part of what we do, right? The I, it's not about you anymore. About us learning and what we do.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. So, I'm going to, many of your examples, reasons for those statements, definitely hit on what the literature identifies, and you will see where you fit in here. So formative assessment is not the mature practice it should be, I think, for a few reasons. One is that there's this view of teaching and learning as disparate activities, distinctly different things. I teach, you learn. Okay, that's been very dominant in U.S. education. It's very behavioral. Erickson says that teachers are not provided the experiences to learn to make sense of thinking as they teach, and he calls this clinical judgment. What do you think about that? He also says, and several of your comments definitely converged on this, he says that Americans confuse the measurement of learning with systemic practices for promoting learning. So that high school teacher, I think there was a confusion for her between measuring learning and simply assessing it to see if kids are getting it. And so she thought, well, she was in the measurement mode. This is grade inflation, right? And then last, Erickson says that that industry, the educational measurement industry, has been so successful that teachers invalidate their own classroom assessments of students. We don't think our assessments are important, but they are. But they are. The British, by the way, what we call assessment for learning, they call teacher assessment. It's the stuff that the teachers are doing in an ongoing way in the classroom. But here's another thing that I think undermines the ability, the uptake of formative assessment in U.S. classrooms. Take a look at our assessment policies in the U.S. Now, I want to make very clear that I am not against standardized testing. It does have a role. It really does have a role. But what I think is U.S. policymakers give very little attention to formative assessment and its very significant role in improving teaching and improving learning. I'm going to mention Pedro again. He's already talked about how the current testing regime, Pedro talked about how the current testing regime has dumbed down the curriculum and how it has been really quite hurtful. The Common Core state standards, I'm not against that. I think it's a very noble effort, but the effectiveness of a state's curriculum depends on a single standardized test. It gets measured by a single standardized test. So we're still in that whole same pattern of dumbing down curriculum so that we can pass the test. There's PARC, of course, and there's smarter balanced assessment system that the United States has been subjected to, Illinois' PARC. And we know that states across the nation have pushed back on this. So we'll have to see how it all pans out. We'll have to see how it pans out. I'm concerned because as long as we're in this current testing regime, teachers just won't have the freedom to feel, the freedom to do what they feel is appropriate for their students. Now, psychometricians are people who are trained in testing and measurement. That's what they do for a living. But even the psychometricians say that high-stakes testing redirects, it absolutely redirects teaching efforts in ways that limit student learning. When I taught in California, we used a test preparation called ZAP, the CAP, CAP being the California Assessment Program. We had to teach the CAP for 20 minutes every single day, just teaching the kids how to bubble in things. We had ZAP the CAP assemblies. We had ZAP the CAP buttons and banners. We even sent ZAP the CAP letters home to parents, right? Big campaign all over the state of California on zapping the CAP. Did we zap the CAP? See, I don't even need to tell you. No, not even close. Not even close. All that time, money, and energy dedicated to zapping the CAP, and the effects were negligible, if any. Time, money, and effort would have been better spent on teachers and teaching. And guys, we know this. We know this. But we can't seem to shake ourselves out of it. And everyone talks about, we need the administrators to do this, we need the administrators to do that. I say, why don't we as teachers start going forth and saying, wait a minute, we know some things about how this works. We know that this testing regime is not helpful. It's probably more harmful than anything. Let's get together as teams of teachers and figure out how to do things better. Let's go to our administrators and tell them this is the way it needs to be. Teachers have more power. You all have more power than you realize. And that was something I didn't appreciate until I stepped out of the classroom. Lots of power there. Don't be misled. Here's that tough nut to crack thing again. Summative benchmark assessments, the ones being sold especially by these companies, are not the same as formative assessment practices, so don't be confused. Formative assessment practices are non-evaluative, and they're supposed to provide teachers with the information they need to do a better job of teaching so their students do a better job of learning. So don't get those confused. Someone in the audience already said the tendency is to think of assessments as a paper and pencil thing. They can be, as exit slips and so forth, but remember they're non-evaluative. Summative benchmark assessments are used to evaluate students. So here's the presentation in review. All right, I'm going to turn this slide off. I'm going to ask you to take out a piece of paper and I'll give you a test. You're supposed to gasp. I wanted you to just briefly get the feeling of how students feel when they're being tested on material they haven't been prepared for because maybe they don't do their homework or they just haven't had opportunities in class to learn. So take a look at this. These are some of the takeaways that I want you to consider in this talk. Give you a few seconds to read it, and then I want you to turn to your partner and see if you can reconstruct the items on this list, or even a different set of items about takeaways. Give you about 2 minutes to do that. Read and then start talking. That's an example of some things I used to do when I taught. If I had some main ideas I wanted to make sure students understood, I would put them on an overhead projector. Yes, I'm dating myself. I would put them on an overhead projector, have them read them, see if they agreed that those were the things they learned, talk among themselves, and then move on to a related topic, non-evaluative. As you go through today's sessions and tomorrow's reflection session, I want you to think about the 3 high leverage practices that we are focusing on in the Chancellor's Academy. And I want you to think about how these practices that we are targeting promote, facilitate assessment for learning. I leave you with this. I find it hopeful because I do believe in formative assessment. It needs to be a natural part of our instructional practices. Edmund Gordon says, despite the current strong emphasis on accountability and the sorting function that continues to be imposed on assessment, I predict that the educational assessments of the future will be increasingly concerned with the improvement of teaching and learning as its principal purpose. Okay. Thank you very much for your attention this morning. I'm still very sorry it was not Charles Payne, but you've been wonderful. I do have a question here, and I think this comes from our director. What are some effective exercises for learning to teach, for learning to listen to and hear students? That's a very good question. It's part of the clinical judgment that Fred Erickson talks about, being able to hear what they are saying. And I think it comes after a whole lot of practice, but a good way to start is by having students write responses. So that puts you in a position of reading what they're saying and making sense of what they're trying to convey to you. Read the writing. Some of us are not natural good listeners. We just aren't. Our partners might tell us that, right? You don't listen well. You don't listen well. So giving students an opportunity to write to you. I used to have a mailbox I made it out of a shoe carton, a thing you put shoes in. Thank you. Thank you, Kara. And they could drop a note to me anytime about anything. Now, I did this at the elementary level. I'm not so sure if it worked for high school, because I think I'd be horrified by some of the notes that would be dropped to me. But it worked very nicely at the elementary school, and I got academic questions, I got questions about relationships, Susie won't play with me anymore on the playground, but it made me pay attention to the concerns of my students. And I think if you have a hard time listening and trying to at least feel like you're not hearing your students, having them write to you is a good first way to start. Okay? Any other questions? Thank you very much for your time and attention. And